Welcome to Planes, Trains, and Batels, Transportation in World War II, Philippines. Thanks for joining us, whether you're here on site at Ayala Museum or online via Zoom or Facebook Live. Our program today is short and sweet, so let's begin by rising for the national anthem.
Tumayo po tayong lahat, ilagay ang kanang kamay sa ating dibdib at sabay-sabay nating awitin ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Magiliw, sa silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hirang, tuyang ng magiting, sa manlulupi, kita pagsitiil, sa dagat at bundok, sa siwoy at sa langit mong bughaw. May bilatang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kitsap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng duwan at ipagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na ba't may mga api ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
A warm welcome again to both our on-site and our online audience. My name is Charlene Diaz, and I'm the head of programs for Filipinos Heritage Library. I'll also be your host for today's event. Since I promised that our program would be short and sweet, let me introduce our first speaker. As we emerged out of the pandemic and returned to on-site activities, such as today's lecture, our first speaker was the steady hand that guided the Arts and Culture Division. Rather than backing away from the challenges posed by the pandemic, she launched an omni-channel strategy that nurtured engagement between Ayala Museum and the public. This omni-channel strategy involves programming across different sites and platforms, on-site, off-site, and online. It is a strategy that FHL is following for these Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures. Please give a warm welcome to Elizabeth Gustilo, whom we fondly call Mariles, the Director of the Arts and Culture Division of Ayala Foundation.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Again, welcome to Trains, Planes, Batels. I had to make sure I pronounce that properly. Transportation in World War II Philippines, the first talk of the inaugural Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures. The Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures celebrates the memory of the late Roderick Hall, the man who donated to Filipinos Heritage Library's showcase collection on World War II. Born in Manila of Basque, Filipino, Scottish, and Spanish heritage, Rod witnessed both the Japanese occupation and the liberation of the city. These formative experiences had a profound impact on him as a young boy and shaped his eventual life mission, and that is to ensure that World War II memories are preserved for future generations in hopes that it will not happen again. Beginning with 700 items, the Roderick Hall collection now comprises more than 5,000 pieces of World War II-related books, manuscripts, and audiovisual files, establishing FHL as a premier source of World War II scholarship in the region. And this corpus of knowledge only continues to grow. As first speaker of the Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures, we are honored to have with us today Dr. Ricardo T. the country's foremost World War II historian. Dr. Jose will shed light on the extent of the Philippine transportation system before and during the Japanese occupation, who controlled it, and how this system affected ordinary Filipinos. We would also like to acknowledge the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines. The friendship and support the U.S. Embassy has extended to FHL, particularly during the recently concluded Project Liberation, broadened the reach of World War II understanding. And we hope for many more collaborations in the future. Through lectures such as this one and other programs activating Roderick Hall's collection, it is our hope that through the next generation of historians and scholars, some of them who are here today, World War II scholarship will remain vibrant. The lecture series also aims to reach Filipinos here in the homeland and over the world. As you know, we are now omni-channel, encouraging them to draw insights and inspiration from our history and about Filipino resilience and innovation. Thank you, and I hope you are enriched by this afternoon's lecture.
Thank you, Ms. Mariles, for those inspiring remarks. Now we're going to hear from some of Roderick Hall's closest collaborators as they pay tribute to a dear friend.
Rod described himself as a man with a mission and a man in a hurry. His mission was to collect as many materials on the experiences of Filipinos during World War II and to place them in a library that would ensure that these are shared with today's generation as well as those in the future. And he found this repository as well as partners with us in the Filipinas Heritage Library. So in 2010, Rod shipped his entire collection, lock, stock, and barrel, of 700 volumes from his home in London to FHL in Makati. Through the years, his collection has grown to more than 2,000 print and non-print materials on World War II, making the Roderick Hall collection FHL's crown jewel. As such, it is FHL's centerpiece, literally and figuratively, because we now revolve our collection focus around the period immediately before, during, and right after World War II, identified as the formative period of Philippine nationhood.
To collect books and various other historical materials relating to the Philippines during that war and to make this more accessible to the general public. He turned this collection over to the Filipinas Heritage Library, where it now forms a major part of its holdings as the Roderick Hall Collection. But Rod was not one to simply donate books. He wanted other people to use them and to research more on the war. He wanted to add more materials and was constantly in search of new directions for the collection. To this end, he was able to negotiate digitization of numerous manuscripts in various collections around the Philippines. He wanted to provide as many different perspectives as possible, and when he learned of the large body of works in Japanese, aimed to acquire as much as possible for the collection.
Why are you collecting Japanese publications about the Battle of Philippines, even though you do not understand Japanese language? You said to me. I always answer this question like that. I want next future generation to know what happened in Philippines during the Asia Pacific War and the Philippines under Japanese rule. However, told me. The real reason is that collecting Japanese books is to make peace of my mind and making requiem for my deceased family. As a post-war Japanese generation, I promise you to try to make no more war society, and also to try not to create the kind of people such as you and your family horribly experienced in Philippines. I think the Japanese should know the facts of this history. I believe this is my mission as a Japanese.
Current thinking on the previous century, with its many upheavals and wars, is that we all have an ethical obligation to remember that history. But understandably, not everyone takes up that burden because the memory of war, especially for persons who witnessed it, is painful. The late Mr. Rod Hall was deeply courageous in that sense of taking up an ethical burden. He took pains to give World War II its proper mourning, not just for himself, but also for our country, America and Japan, whose materials he collected. He helped strengthen our cultural memory in the hope of preventing the return of suffering. And now with his passing, we in turn at Filipinos Heritage Library and Ayala Foundation have an obligation to make his legacy and his commemoration of history endure.
Now, let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Ricardo T. Jose has been a cherished partner and steadfast collaborator of both Roderick Hall and FHL. As the country's foremost historian on the Second World War in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific, there is no one better to formally launch the Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures. Dr. Jose is a professor at the Department of History, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He specializes in military and diplomatic history with a focus on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. He obtained his BA and MA in history from the University of the Philippines and his PhD from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Jose has published extensively on the historical relays between Japan and the Philippines. His most recent book is Guerrilla Days in the Philippine South, 1942 to 1945, released in April of last year. We'll be able to show this book to you later, as Dr. Jose is generously donating a copy to FHL. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ricardo T. Jose.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and inaugural lecture of the lecture series for Rod. And thank you on a Saturday afternoon. Now, Saturday afternoons are usually reserved for family and friends and other things. So thank you for being here. It is with great honor that I am speaking as the inaugural lecture in this Rod Hall Memorial Series. I know Rod Hall very well. I heard his stories many, many times. And one thing about him is he was very proactive. He was dynamic. He wanted to go all over the Philippines. And up to the last time that I met him, he was really trying to get as much of the library online, not just a physical library, but he wanted to put as much of it as possible online. So when I was asked to give the inaugural talk here, the suggestion was I talk about Filipino mobility during the war. And so I decided on this title rather than mobility, which sounded rather scholarly to scholarly. I thought a play on words on the movie, the planes, cars, and trains. It was a comedy movie several years ago, except that we modified it to fit the Philippines. So we have planes, trains, and Batels. When I first suggested the title, I was asked, didn't you make a typographical error? Shouldn't it have been battle? And I said, no, that's where the Filipino side comes in. It's Batel. And that's a kind of boat that was used during the war, during the Japanese occupation. And I'll be explaining that in a little while. So let's move on. Again, the background to this is very significant. You have, it's not a train ticket, actually it's a bus ticket. And you have the Japanese flag behind. But the picture here is very significant because it shows a train that is running in front of Mount Mayon with Japanese flags in it. This was the inaugural run of the first train from Manila to Legazpi in April of 1943. So almost exactly 80 years ago, that picture was taken. So let's move on. Pre-war. Before the war, what was transportation like? Because before we can understand what happened during the war, we have to take a quick review of what the transportation system was like in the Philippines before the war. We know that immediately before the war, the Philippines was preparing for independence. We were in the Commonwealth stage. We are preparing for independence in 1946. And insofar as land transportation was concerned, the road transportation, we had a lot of cars. In fact, the 1941 census would say there were 33,000 cars registered in the Philippines, with half of them in Manila. Now, that sounds very similar to what's going on today also. We have much more than 33,000 cars. But 33,000 cars in the pre-war Philippines, that was something that was already significant. And these are just the private cars. This does not include public transportation, buses, and so forth. The buses, there were big bus companies operating within Manila, and the provincial bus lines were also very active. Before it became known as Batangas Laguna Tayabas Bus Company, or BLTB as we knew it later, it was simply LTB, Laguna Tayabas Bus Company. Later on, they added the Batangas part. There was Benguet Auto Line, which was the line that took you to Baguio from the Damortis station in Pangasinan. And then there was Pambusco, the Pampanga Bus Company. And then in the Visayas, you also had bus companies, and also the same thing in the Mindanao area as well. In Metro Manila, there was what was called the Tranvia, the streetcar. And this was run by Meralco. And that's why it's called Meralco, because it was Manila Electric and Rail, Manila Electric, Rail, and Light Company. So it included the rail, which was the Tranvia, and that was the main public transportation system in Manila at that time. People were riding it of all classes. It was a very functional thing. It resembled kind of the streetcar system in San Francisco. In fact, the company that made it was basically the same company that made ours. But aside from the cars, aside from the tramvias, aside from the buses, you also had the more traditional form of transportation, which were drawn by horses or carabaos. So right in the streets of very modern Manila, inside Rizal Avenue, you would see carabao carts, you would see calesas, you would see carretelas. Today you still see some of them. If you go to Chinatown, you will still see some of the carretelas there. But there were more at that time. If today we complain about tricycle drivers or motorcycle drivers not following the rules. In the pre-war world, it was the Kalesa driver. They turned without signaling and all of this kind of thing. So there were carretelas, there were Kalesas, and there were the Carabao carts, which were carrying cargo all over Manila. Insofar as rail, so if we are to expand outside of the wheeled transportation, we were very proud of our railroad transportation system. This, of course, had started way back in the late 19th century, and Manila Railroad Company was the premier railroad company in the Philippines at that time. So it started from Tutuban and went all the way up to La Union, and down south it reached down to Legazpi. It was a point of pride when President Quezon actually drove the last spike, which connected Manila with Legazpi. That was a major historical event which connected Manila to Legazpi. So you have the Legazpi run. It was not yet called the Bicol Express at that time. That's a post-war phenomenon. But we were going to that point. Apart from the Manila Railroad Company, there also were private railroad lines in Cebu, in Iloilo, and it seems that there also was in Mindanao, not a very well-developed one, but it was there. And in addition to this, there were cargo hauling railroad, private railroad lines, particularly for the sugar interests in Negros, in Pampanga, in Tarlac, and so forth. So the transportation system on land was very, very highly developed before the war. Again, remember, we were looking towards independence in 1946, and this transportation system was both a source of pride and a source of headaches. Why headaches? This is what Manila looked like just before the war. These are 1941 photographs. The left side, you see Rizal Avenue. There are two streetcars there, there are two tranvias there, and doesn't seem like there's much traffic. You don't see that view anymore today. But on the right side, you see Jones Bridge, and that's rush hour traffic. And already at that time, they were saying, there are too many vehicles on the road. And notice how the carretelas and the horse-drawn vehicles are clogging one lane, and you have the motorized vehicles on the other lane. Interesting thing about this is that before the war, all traffic was on the left side. We were like Japan, we were like Britain, and basically like Europe. Everything was on the left. The right side driving comes only in 1945. But that was traffic already then. And people were complaining, it's noisy, they're honking their horns incessantly, and so forth. So we already had some of those headaches that we're still experiencing today. But still, compared to what we have today, it was manageable. Now, insofar as continuing on with the cars, this is an ad from the 1920s, actually. So the magazines were saying, buy your cars. These are Chevrolets, and then you have Cadillac cars and Ford. There even was a rather popular magazine for Ford car owners. It was supposed to be one that reached 10,000 subscribers, the Ford Car Owners Society kind of thing. They actually had a magazine that came out every month. So this was something that we were seeing. We saw gasoline stations all over the place. We saw car repair. We had all these vulcanizing shops and so forth. So very state-of-the-art, very modern. And insofar as public transportation was concerned, if it couldn't be handled by the carretela, if it could not be handled by the calesa, if it couldn't be handled by the jitney, or the taxis, there existed what was called the jitney. Now, the jitney was a modified pickup truck. These were European pickups that came here, and you have the back, you have a slight change to accommodate passengers. So this is the immediate predecessor of the jeepney. So if we think the jeepneys are the first of their kind, before the war, this is what we already had. They were kind of cars for hire, actually, and they ran short distances. You'll see this is in front of Manila's post office, and this was taken in 1941. So it was looking very bright at that time. And these are some of the buses. This is from the Benguet, or rather this is the Luzon bus company, and these were very modern buses at that particular time, very functional. Manila Railroad Company, some of the locomotives like we have here, these were quite old, 1910s, 1920s, but Manila Railroad Company was modernizing. By the 1940s, they had very modern diesel engines coming as well. And this is what Tutuban Station looked like in 1940. Now, it looks like a European train station, very European. We have not seen this again, the trains going north, trains going south, very systematic, very stable timetables, and so forth. And this is when President Quezon drove that last spike to connect Manila with Legazpi. Very big historical event when that last spike was drawn, and Quezon himself was there to drive that last spike. Now, what about ships? So, or rather, let's start with the airlines first. The airlines, we also had a thriving airline industry from the 1930s. So you would have one of the earliest plane companies, one of the earliest airline companies was something called INAEC. That's Ilocos, or rather Iloilo Negros Air Express Company. So it serviced basically Iloilo, Bacolod, and Manila. It represented the sugar interests of that time. It was a very successful one, and their airfield was not in downtown Manila, it was in Grace Park in Caloocan. So the remains of the field are no longer there. But that was one of the first, and it was a very thriving aircraft and airline company. Then we had Philippine Aerial Taxi Company, that's PATCO. And that was supposed to be within Luzon, and it was from Manila to Baguio and Manila to Legazpi and so forth. Eventually that dried up, it became bankrupt, and it was bought out and became PAL, or Philippine Airlines. And what is interesting about Philippine Airlines is the place we are in now is roughly the same place where Philippine Airlines flew its first flight in April of 1941, from here to Baguio. So this is a very important, a very historic place that we are actually in. So Philippine Airlines, these are all domestic lines. Now on the international field, we were also very proud of the fact that there was a Pan-American plane that was coming every week or so. And this was the Pan-American Clipper. And it came from San Francisco. It could not fly direct to Manila at that time. It was too long a distance. So it would stop by several islands in the Pacific, Hawaii, Guam, Wake, and then finally Manila. Then from Manila, it would connect to either Singapore or Hong Kong. That was a very profitable route, actually, and it connected Manila to the rest of the world by air. So the first flight, actually, of that Pan Am Clipper was historic because it took place in 1935, just after the Commonwealth was inaugurated. It didn't carry passengers, it just carried mail. But for those people writing letters, the fact that airmail was now a reality was something fantastic. Today, we don't know about airmail anymore. It's all internet and email. But then, imagine you're cutting the time a letter was sent from the States to the Philippines, from 1 month or so, it would arrive in a matter of days. So that was something fantastic. And that's what the Pan-American Clippers did. It cut all the time, the distances. And then insofar as shipping, again, the Philippines being an archipelago, shipping is very, very important here. So the very big lines, Compañía Marítima, Aboitiz, Negros Navigation, some of them still exist today, or at least traces of them. These are domestic ships. Some of them were very large. We were very proud of the merchant marine fleet that we had. They were sailing on time. They were safe as compared to some of the ships that are going around today. But they were reliable, they were comfortable, and it was the pride of the Philippines. Some of them were very fast. Now, there also were international routes. Now, some of the local companies were actually sailing all the way to Australia, to Japan, and even to the United States. And those were Philippine maritime companies. Of course, the Japanese had their own lines coming here, going to Davao and so forth. The Americans had the American President lines coming here. That was a more luxurious version. But the fact that Philippine-owned ships were actually traveling abroad was something that made us very proud that we had a well-developed aerial system and maritime system, plus the land transportation system. So this was the main hangar of the Iloilo Negros Air Express Company. I think this one was in Iloilo, but again, the main airport here was in Grace Park in Caloocan. These were the pride of their planes at that time. This was one of their planes. It's one of those rare colored images at that time. This is an original color. Here they're loading the cargo, and this is actually a video. It's actually a moving picture, a few seconds. And then, insofar as PAL is concerned, this was the first PAL plane that flew up to Baguio from here. And the other picture that you see on the right is the plane in flight having taken off from Nielsen Airfield right here. So this was the logo of PAL at that time. And the field it was took off from Nielsen Field. That's Ayala, Makati Avenue, Paseo de Rojas. In fact, you will see the building here. That's Nielsen Tower. That is where the expensive restaurant is today. No? So you can see the outlines of you have Ayala, and this is Makati Avenue. This is Ayala. That's Paseo de Rojas. So already at that time, you see the images were developed. This was what the Pan American Clipper looked like. It was an amphibious plane because it could not land. There were no runways big enough for it. And if it landed in the Pacific Islands, it would have to land in the water anyway. Tickets were very expensive for this plane, but it did show that you could cut travel time very significantly. Insofar as the ships are concerned, this was the pride of the Philippine Merchant Marine Fleet, the SS Corregidor. It was the fastest ship in the Philippine Merchant Marine Fleet. It was actually a Royal Navy ship in World War I. It had participated in the Battle of Jutland and so forth. But we had bought it and made it into a passenger ship. This basically ran from Manila to Bacolod to Iloilo, all the way down to Mindanao, and made regular runs. It was the most comfortable, it was the most luxurious, and it was the fastest ship we actually had. So this was the pride of the Philippine Merchant Marine system. Even Manila Railroad had its own ships. This is the Mayon, which again left regularly and which was something that people could be proud of, very comfortable. And the ports, we did not have North Harbor yet at that time, so all the inter-island ships went to the Pasig River. It was clean at that time, and for the international ships, they were all here. This is today, this is Pier, this was Pier 7. Today this is Pier 13. Pier 15 comes up after the war. And then these other piers here, some of them were army piers and the other were for civilian use. So I mean, it was all very clean, it was all very modern, it was all looking forward. We were looking forward to the near future. Now, the thing is, what happened in 1941? So we now see the transportation system was well established. Now, with the advent of war, or with the shadows, with the war clouds coming in, you have the military stepping in and saying, we need that transportation. The transportation cannot simply be left in civilian hands. And so the Philippine Army, when it was mobilized to become the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, would begin commandeering civilian buses, civilian trucks, civilian cars, and all sorts of other things. Most of this was to transport soldiers from one point to another, from the mobilization centers to the main camps and so forth, and they used whatever they could. Insofar as the civilians were concerned, the big danger that was seen there was, what if Manila was suddenly bombed by the Japanese? Then places where there were large numbers of people, like Tondo, very flammable places. These were dangerous to have large concentrations of people. So it was felt that these areas should be evacuated as soon as the war breaks out. So there were plans to move the people in Tondo out by bus or by train, bring them to Montalban or bring them to other provinces that are nearby, so that they would be dispersed. And even if the bombs fell, then at least they would be, the concentration of people would be limited. So this is one of those pictures which shows actually that Pampanga Bus Company being used as a military transport. So you have these military officers standing in front of the bus, ready to be used for military purposes. And then even the railroad cars in Negros, this is in Negros, in the sugar plantations, they were used to move soldiers from one place to another as well. So there was commandeering of the vehicles. the corregidor that we had seen earlier, the pride of the Philippine Merchant Marine Fleet. This was also taken by the army, and it brought the soldiers from Negros to Manila just before the war started. And so this is it, waiting for the Negros soldiers to board the ship. As for the civilians, the bus system was again tasked to take the people of Tondo to the safer grounds. This was supposed to be the plan. It did not work out that way, unfortunately. So it seemed like in pre-war times, things were logical, things would work properly, but when the war finally broke out, things did not work out as expected. So as the war comes in, you have the army again commandeering more of the vehicles, ships, aircraft, trains. All of PAL's planes, all of the INAEC planes and so forth were commandeered by the army, and the civilian planes became what was known as the Bamboo Air Force. So they flew from Manila to Bataan to Corregidor and down south to Mindanao and Visayas. Transportation would be disrupted because of the war, and the Japanese would bomb railway lines. They bombed Baguio, they bombed Manila, they bombed Davao, and among the first things to really be disrupted was the transport system. Trains would be taken by the army. The airfields were bombed very quickly, and some of them were put out of use. And as the Americans left Manila, you would have a scorched earth policy being adopted, which meant that fuel stocks in Manila and in Cebu and elsewhere were set on fire, so the Japanese would not be able to capture those, or they could not use them. Also, anything that the Japanese might be able to use, including railroad bridges, these were blown up. So the whole transportation system begins to fall apart because of the war. Plus the fact that the Japanese Air Force was bombing airfields and railroad stations as well. So the whole thing was disrupted. For the civilians, this resulted in fear, confusion, and as they wanted to evacuate the cities because the cities were being bombed, it's here that they would face this severe lack of transportation. So this is an interesting bus ticket because this is actually dated December 8. And the guy who bought this probably heard that the war had started and immediately bought this ticket and left that morning. If you look at it, it's the date is December 8, and he takes a morning ride, and there's an afternoon transfer. So it's too bad that the person who owned this is now dead, but it tells a lot of story just by itself. So we talked about the destruction. So partly destruction on the left. The pictures on the left show the railway system being disrupted by Japanese bombing. The right side, you have Filipino soldiers preparing a bridge. This is up in the north now, that is being prepared for demolition, so the Japanese would not be able to use the rail system. As the bombers came in, this is a scene in the port area of Manila, cars being burning as they were hit by Japanese bombs. And the buses, they were commandeered by the army, and this is one of those BLTB buses that was brought to Baguio, rather to Bataan. You will notice the diamond-shaped logo there, which is BLTB. So this is an interesting picture because it's in the hospital area in Bataan, and next to the bus is one of the early jeeps that had already arrived at that time. These were the very first model jeeps that came here. These are pictures taken by Japanese bombers. This is Iloilo airfield actually being bombed by Japanese planes. This is the INAEC main airfield of INAEC at that time. And those who wanted to evacuate, this is a scene in Tutuban where you have the civilians wanting to go to Bulacan or Laguna or elsewhere, and there were simply no trains for them to ride on anymore. Without the trains, you have them going on foot, which will become one of the experiences of most people during the war. If you cannot ride, you have to walk. And the word to describe this was evacuate. So they all had to evacuate, and it became Filipinized as bakwet. So even today, we still use the word bakwet, Mindanao and elsewhere. That is a World War II word, and this is a family from Cavite that is escaping the bombing of Cavite Navy Yard. If you didn't have a cart, then you simply walked. And this would again be typical of much of the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. And this is one of those planes that was used by the so-called Bamboo Air Force. It's actually a US Navy plane that was a reconnaissance plane, but I chose this specifically because this is the plane in which Carlos P. Romulo took to leave Bataan. So this actually carried about 3 or 4 people, and as the picture portrays here, it's taking off of Mariles, and Romulo would have been inside this. So now that the Japanese were here, how did the whole thing change? Now, when the Japanese came in, definitely the most important priority was the military. What the military needed, they got. And so in order to maximize what was here, what they could salvage of the transportation system, they established a controlled system. In fact, the whole economy was controlled. Everything was rationed. Everything was limited. Everything had to be controlled by the military administration. And all transportation that they could seize was consolidated under the Japanese military administration. And since it was very important also to check on people, that people had to be kept basically in place, it was impossible for anyone to move from one place to another without a travel permit. So all of a sudden, everybody needed papers, residential certificates, passes, and all of this. Anybody who was living anywhere in the Philippines controlled by the Japanese would have to have these travel passes that they would have to show to the sentries. Apart from that also, everything the Japanese military could use, the ships that survived, the planes that survived, the military vehicles, the buses, they seized and they used for their own purposes. Whatever they could reconstruct or whatever they could salvage, they would salvage. That included ships. They would repair the ships. They would restore some of the railroads. By April of 1942, as Bataan falls, you have the railroad from Manila to at least San Fernando and to Tarlac already reconstructed, which is why when we hear about the Death March, that phase of the Death March from San Fernando to Tarlac is on trains because the Japanese had reconstructed the train system up to that. Later on, they would reconstruct it all the way to San Fernando, La Union, and they would, a year later, reconstruct it to run to Legazpi. So the ships, the same thing. The ships many of the ships had been sunk. They raised as many of them as they could, and they used them for their own purposes. Again, military priority was top, and all the fuel they could find, they seized, they took over, and they had to control all the fuel. There were checkpoints for anyone moving around. The railroad was placed under direct Japanese military control. There was a specific Japanese military regiment for trains that was assigned to the Philippines. And in order to rationalize the shipping system too, there was a Philippine Shipping Association that was formed. So these are Japanese propaganda photographs showing the reconstruction of the trains. We have on the left side a train leaving the Caloocan Depot, heading for Tutuban. And on the right side, we have that view of the train running to Legazpi with Mount Mayon in the back. Now, there is a hidden story behind that. While the propaganda would say Manila to Legazpi line had been completed, and there was a special day that it took place, and they celebrated it with the Japanese flags. Even Legazpi Station was filled with bunting and Japanese flags. The hidden thing here was that the guerrillas had actually sabotaged several of the bridges that the train was going to pass en route to Legazpi. And in at least one place, the Japanese were unable to restore that bridge that the guerrillas had blown up. So they had to send another train from Legazpi to the place where the bridge was blown. And they had to cross the river on boats and take that train all the way to Legazpi. The controlled press, of course, did not say anything about that. It said successful, completed line, and so forth. But that Manila-Legazpi route was always very vulnerable to guerrilla attacks. We mentioned the Death March. This is an artist's impression of the scene in Angeles when the cars that were passing with prisoners of war would have their doors open, and the residents of Angeles would throw food and water and whatever they could to the prisoners of war. This is a picture of the Japanese soldiers in Davao. So there was a small railroad system there, probably for Abaca, that the Japanese had captured. And insofar as the travel passes, this was the ubiquitous Japanese pass in English and in Japanese to be able to show the sentries that you were authorized to pass. And this is not filled, but this is to the Manila branch of the military police, the Kempeitai. So it had to be filled up properly, and it had to have the proper marks of the Japanese approval. They also converted all the traffic signs to Japanese. So stop and go and everything were converted to Japanese. Even the station names were converted to Japanese as well. And in order to save gasoline, since we were not making our own oil, we didn't have sources of oil, they immediately began cutting down on the use of fuel, and they came out with alco gas, alcohol converted into gas, made out of sugar cane, made out of coconut, and so forth. So this was all the vehicles that were outside had to be registered with the Japanese. This is a registration form for the cars. And again, if you were to use the car, it had to be official, it had to be authorized, and so forth. And in fact, once you were authorized to run your car, you would be given stickers like this, which you would put on your windshield. The meaning of this actually gives you the date of effectivity. It also says that large character in the middle actually says this is provisional, this is temporary, this is only good for this particular day. So it's not a permanent pass. The Japanese realized that with the disruption of the transport system, the jitneys were gone. They reconstructed part of the bus lines. This time the buses would use charcoal, or the buses would use alco gas. And here you have what were called the city buses. The Meralco buses were no longer running, and instead what you had were city buses. So here we have the conductresses of this Manila city bus system. And on the right side, we have a bus ticket that celebrates the anniversary of the outbreak of the war. So this actually did not work very well. In fact, Filipino smart Alex said city bus was actually an acronym to mean come immediately, try your best, Uncle Sam. So that was what city bus was supposed to have meant then. So this, again, the street names changed to Japanese. The tranvia was still in use at that time, but gradually the tranvia would disappear because they would lack spare parts and so forth. Here, this is 1942. It's still functioning, but by 1944, it would be very difficult to ride this. So insofar as aircraft were concerned, the Japanese, of course, held everything in the air. There actually was a very limited run airline that the Japanese opened called the Southwest Pacific Airlines. And that was basically between Manila, Taiwan, and Japan. That was militarily controlled, and I don't know anyone who was authorized to ride in it. Now, when the Second Republic was inaugurated, the Japanese military gave the Second Republic, Laurel, its first and only airplane, which was called the Kalayaan. It was a Japanese plane, actually, military transport plane, but that was something that at least we could be proud of. The president had his own plane. And this is what the Kalayaan looked like at that time. But you will notice while there is a Philippine flag and it says Kalayaan, there is a Japanese circle here, which indicates it's still Japanese. And the pilots were Japanese. But Laurel used this to fly to Japan a couple of times. Vargas did so, and so forth. So this is one of those things. It was probably based here also in Nielsen Field. So this particular photograph was taken here. Now, since everything was controlled by the Japanese, we know what happens when things are overly controlled by an authoritarian system. We would have to find our own ways to survive. And so we come up with adaptation. We come up with our own ingenuity on how to circumvent the rules or how to survive despite the rules. So insofar as adaptation was concerned, since it was difficult to ride cars or anything using gasoline, what came back to the streets were the horse-drawn vehicles, the carretelas, the calesas, and the Carabao carts. Those again filled the streets of Manila because the gasoline vehicles were now very much limited and they were under control of the Japanese. There were new forms of transportation on the street that were called the charcoal bus. This was a bus that did not run on gasoline, but it ran on charcoal. So again, we could make the charcoal here, and we could make the buses run. That was one way of saving fuel. Today we talk about electric vehicles and all of this. Now, at that time, we had our own version, used charcoal. The only problem with the charcoal bus is that the power output was much less than that of a gasoline bus. So people who rode this would tell me before that if it went up to Jones Bridge, for example, the bus did not have the power to go up slope, and the passengers had to come down and push the bus up. And once it reached the top, they would board the bus again and it'd come down. The other problem with the charcoal bus is, as we know, with charcoal burning engines, there's a lot of smoke that comes out. So for those who are riding the rear of the bus, they would come out stained with the smoke of the charcoal bus. So apart from the charcoal bus, there was an engine that had been developed in Japan that was called the Ippopi. It was already it was something that had been devised in Japan to run on substitute fuels, and that was a Japanese invention that was brought here. So Ippopi became a standard name, particularly for car maintenance people who began refiguring engines of cars and buses to run on alternative fuels, alcogas and others. And there was a unique form of transportation that came out at that time that was called the dokar. The dokar was a word that anyone who lived at that time would recognize. Just that the post-war world never ever saw the dokar again. This was a horse-drawn vehicle, but it was a luxury vehicle. It was not your standard calesa. It was not your standard carretela. It was something that was on pneumatic wheels, that had shock absorbers, that had springs, and if the owner was richer, you would actually even have it on a car body. So you'd have a car body cut in half and attached to the horse. And therefore, you'd be riding on in comfort. You would have very nice soft seats, and you would have rubber tires and so forth. So the dokar became a form of transportation, horse-drawn, that was common in most of the cities at the time. Insofar as boats were concerned, the Japanese controlled all of the large ships. So people moving around the Visayas, Mindanao area, they would use the batel. And that's where we come up with the batel in the title. So sailing ships came back into use. They became very much in vogue. Not only the batels, but several other sailing ships that were there before the war. Now, since the steamships were gone, you are now sailing in the ships, in these sailing ships. Now, the Japanese needed a lot more shipping than we could actually provide. So the Japanese began a whole series, a whole program of building wooden ships. And this was not a phenomenon of the Philippines alone. This was something they did in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Singapore. They were building wooden ships as a large measure to provide shipping for their merchant marine. They needed more ships. And because they needed crews for this also, they schooled Filipinos to serve as crews for these wooden ships. Speaking of those ships, you actually even had some of these boats being used by guerrillas. It was indistinguishable. You couldn't tell whether this boat was really civilian or whether it was civilian. So many of them just hid. They were used for trade. They were used for transferring people from here to there. But the guerrillas maximized these, particularly in the Visayas and Mindanao areas. Now, a word that came up also there that became in vogue during the occupation was the word Cadillacad. Cadillac was a very luxurious car before the war, and now it was felt we can't go in the Cadillac anymore, but instead let's walk. But if you want to walk in style, Cadillacad na lang tayo. So that was one of those words that was left out from the war, that continued from the war. So while the Visayas and Mindanao were heavily dependent on shipping, and this time the sailing ships that now civilians were operating, the guerrillas, of course, maximized this, and the guerrillas had their own navy in the Visayas and Mindanao. So this is a picture of Manila during the Japanese occupation with all these calesas and all the horse-drawn vehicles. Gone are the cars, gone are the tranvias and so forth. It's all horse-drawn vehicles. These are the modified horse-drawn vehicles that they came up with. The carretela bus, now extended to hold more passengers. And these are the docars, so the more luxurious forms of calesas that were plying the streets at that time. So you see the one on the bottom right has pneumatic wheels, it has car wheels, and it's supposed to have very nice padded seats. So this was the luxurious way of traveling around Manila at that time. Since the horses became the focus of people at that time, the Japanese said, let us celebrate them, let us honor them. So in 1943, they actually had the day nationwide, Horse Day. And they all paraded the horses and the calesas, very nicely decorated like this. And they said, let's pay homage to the poor horse who has been taken advantage of for so long. And one thing also that came out, if today we see the resurgence of the bicycle, in Manila also, the bicycle came back and people were using the bicycles. And not only bicycles, notice the one on the right side. This was, let's see, that was the tricycle of that time. And you see that the passengers are in front rather than on the side or in the back. And that was very popular at that time, that you'd have someone driving the trike and the passengers in front. Problem with that, of course, is what if it got hit? What if it got involved in an accident? The passengers were the first to get hit in that case. But again, yeah, the fact that the bicycles were now coming out, this was a form of adaptation. It was a form of living with the times. And we talked about the charcoal-fed engines and this ipopi device. So we have the Filipinos copying that and developing bus system based on that as well. And you'd have Philippine mechanics developing that engine as well. So ipopi was the name of the engine, but you have the idea of using alternative fuels then. Of course, the Carabao was star of the show again. And Carabao with his, as the beast of burden, everywhere in the Philippines, you would see this coming out. Hopefully, that will not come to pass today. I mean, we won't that. But again, the fact is, Manila was still subject to floods, or big cities were still subject to floods. This is a 1942 picture, actually, that shows Manila's streets flooded, and the calesas having to wade through the floods of Manila. This is what happened at the end of the war. Now, since transportation became very, very scarce, you see severe overcrowding. This is a tranvia by late 1944 with people oozing out of the tranvia itself. If you have the tranvia overloaded like this, it's going to wear out sooner than later. And they eventually broke down because they were extremely overcrowded like this. Even the regular trains, the few trains that were allowed to move from Manila to the south or to the north, look at how crowded they became. Fortunately, we are not in this situation today. Hopefully, we will never, ever get into this situation again. Now, not only were these instances captured on film, but they were also the subject of editorial cartoons, where you have this calesa driver saying it's 3 pesos to escolta. At that time, that was an unheard of sum. You only were dealing with how many centavos from one place to another in Manila. 3 pesos, that's why the rider is incredulous. Sobrang mahal yata to. And the other one, something that we also tend to see nowadays. The calesa is so overcrowded, and yet the driver is saying, I can accommodate 3 more. So parang mga jeepneys ngayon. It's the same thing again. So these came out in the newspapers at that time. So there's social commentary on what was going on then. And for those, of course, who could not ride, they would walk. And those who were making the footwear, the bakya, were able to appeal to the upper class. This is one of the more extravagant bakya that was made late in the war. that was very highly decorated, Philippine scenes and all of this. So many of these were actually brought home by American soldiers when the war ended, so we can actually still buy these in the States. Now, what about the wooden ships? Again, this was a big program of the Japanese to try to replace the sunken ships with ships built in the Philippines using Philippine wood. This was all over the Philippines. It was in Mindanao, in Mindoro, in Cebu, in southern Tagalog, the Bicol area. You had this all over the places. And on the left side, we have a Japanese launching ceremony for the launching of one of these wooden ships. And on the right side, you see a flotilla of some of these ships plying Manila Bay. This is what the Batel looked like. So this was the standard ship that was going around the Visayas and Mindanao. It was a sailing ship. It was sturdy. It was something that could carry passengers, or it could carry cargo as well. So it was this that dominated the Mindanao and Visayas seas. But for the Mindanao area, the guerrillas became very active. And the guerrillas were using small boats like this. The technical name for this is the dinait, which is one of the older types of sailing vessels that the Philippines was using. Very simple, but could you tell whether this was a guerrilla boat or whether it was a simple cargo or passenger boat? No way of telling what was in it. This is actually a guerrilla boat that was going to Leyte in 1944. The guerrillas also captured a Japanese boat and they converted it into an armed boat. You'll notice here there is a machine gun in front. This was the flagship of the Mindanao Guerrilla Navy. Of course, if it encountered a Japanese ship, it could fight the Japanese ship. And these other ones, these were actually Japanese ships that were captured by the guerrillas and pressed into service by the guerrillas as part of their navy way in the south. This is in Oroquieta, it's Mindanao. As for the others in Mindanao and in the Visayas, they turned to the horse. If they were not just walking, then horseback riding, particularly in Bukidnon, northern Mindanao, Lanao, and so forth. This was the form of transportation then. So, at the end of the war, the whole thing fell apart. We've come up to a period of great destruction. When the American planes began bombing the Philippines, the first targets are strategic Japanese military and naval targets. And one of the first important targets was to disable the rail system. So this is one of the railroad stations. I think this is in the northern part of Luzon. But you have pictures all over. Mindanao, Cebu, Iloilo. You have hundreds of pictures showing the train system being wrecked. In some cases, it's clear enough for you to actually read the station name. So we can see there is one that says Legazpi, and there are others that these planes were flying very, very low, and they were making sure that they destroyed all the trains, all the rolling stock that was there at that particular time. In fact, if you'll notice the white things that you see here, these are parachutes because the planes were flying so low that if they dropped the bomb and it fell immediately, the plane would be hit by the bomb's blast as well. So these had parachutes so that it would slow down the bomb coming down, and by the time the bomb hit the ground, the plane would be several hundred meters away, safe from the explosion. This is Nielsen Field being bombed. So that's Nielsen Field here. So PAL's celebrated airfield to the flight to Baguio. That's here being hit by American bombs. And here you have Santa Ana Racetrack, which is now a big mall already, a circuit. No? But this is what it looked like in 1944. And of course, the ports were also important targets of American planes. This is Zamboanga being raided, being hit by American naval planes. This is Cebu. You can tell it's Cebu because of the 3 piers that you see there. And of course, Manila and other ports were similarly bombed. And in the process of the fighting, partly because of the bombing by aircraft, partly because of the Japanese adopting also a scorched earth policy, you have the bridges everywhere being blown and being destroyed. This is the Santa Cruz Bridge next to the post office, and all the bridges in Manila were blown up and destroyed, and similarly with the other major bridges in the rest of the Philippines. So that meant that, once again, we would have to turn back to foot, walking on foot. And in this particular case, it's an interesting picture. No ambulances. There is a person who's very severely injured. No ambulance, so the ambulance is a push cart. And nurse is pushing, and this is in Taft Avenue, right in front of Philippine Women's University. What the picture does not actually say, that the original caption mentions, is that the nurse who is actually pushing this cart had served in Bataan. She was a nurse in the hospitals in Bataan. And after Bataan surrendered, she was brought to Manila, and she was active throughout the war in Philippine General Hospital. So here she is bringing this patient from Philippine General Hospital to the makeshift hospital in Philippine Women's University. Now multiply this 1,000 times, and you would see that this would have happened in Davao, this would have happened in Baguio, this would have happened in Bacolod and elsewhere. This is just one of those many images that we are left with from the war. Of course, the rail system was destroyed. On the left side, you see what's left of the tranvia. The Japanese were no longer using the tranvia. It could not work. They didn't have enough spare parts. They didn't have enough electricity supply. So what did they do with the tranvias here? This is outside Intramuros. They lined them up outside Bastion de San Diego. And this was a barrier for the Americans attacking Intramuros. So they no longer served the transportation function. They were now simply part of the barricade. Elsewhere in Manila, you would see that also happening. On the upper photograph, you see trucks and vehicles that the Japanese army had seized, and they are now all destroyed, put out of action by American planes. Very quickly, the Americans would realize that the transportation system had to be put back in operation as soon as possible. Military means for civilian purposes as well. So this was the first major locomotive that was brought to Luzon in 1945. It was called the General MacArthur Special. It was landed in La Union, and then it came all the way down to Caloocan. So since, again, not all the trains were running, you even had jeeps that were modified to run on the rails to serve as locomotives. And insofar as the rest of the Philippines, why it was extremely difficult elsewhere in the Philippines, in Mindanao, the bridges had been blown again. And this is very near the Bukidnon-Davao Highway, which was then called Sayre Highway. The bridges were blown, and so the soldiers had no other recourse but to go down the ravines and go up. And this is how difficult the terrain was then. Now, we go into Rebirth. If there was Philippine adaptation during the Japanese occupation, after the war, we would again have to try to adapt to the new conditions after the war. And among them, okay, this is a picture of Binondo right after the war, shortly after the liberation of Manila. And you'd see here ubiquitous military vehicles. These are 6x6 transport trucks, and they were converted to buses at that time. They were definitely military vehicles. Now, the American drivers were not used to driving on the left side of the road. So shortly after Manila was declared free of the Japanese, they said, we will shift to driving on the right. And that resulted in a lot of accidents because the Calesa drivers were not familiar with driving on the right. So they said, okay, postpone it, move it to June or July. And finally, okay, tell everybody we're driving on the right. And so since that time, we've been driving on the right side of the road. Another vehicle that was extremely visible all throughout the Philippines was something called the DUKW, or the Duck. This was an amphibious vehicle that was used in all the landings in the Philippines and also in Europe as well. Many of them were later adapted to Philippine use because they were amphibians, they were good to use, and many fishermen actually got this. And they were using this instead of the batel. This is what they were using instead to go fishing, using, of course, the diesel engines. As late as the 1970s, San Juan still had a fleet of these to use in case of floods. And so you would still see these World War II amphibians still being used in case of floods. Singapore, they still have some of these. They've converted them to tourist purposes, and they go through rivers and beaches and so forth. Now, some of the pre-war jitneys managed to survive. So we have pictures of like this. Again, it's the post office that you see behind. But you see running the pre-war jitney. Somehow it was spared the destruction of the war. But more ubiquitous, more common, was this new form of transportation, which became called the jeepney. This is a 1946 photograph. It's one of the first photographs I've ever seen of a jeepney immediately after the war. So it shows its military design very closely. And this next one, that's the Legislative Building or the National Museum behind it. This other one is even more military in image. It's still probably green, in fact. It's really fresh out of the military depot and now converted into a jeepney. And the bridges, they had to be rebuilt, and the easiest way to rebuild them was to build temporary bridges that were called Bailey bridges. We still have this in use even today. Every time a landslide takes place in Baguio, for example, if you have the Cannon Road being washed out, a Bailey bridge is put there. I was in Mindanao last year, and I found a couple of wartime Bailey bridges. Very rusted, but definitely, this is like we stepped into a time warp. This is a 1945 Bailey Bridge. So these were meant to be temporary bridges, and as we know, this is Jones Bridge. It's very different today, but this was the immediate attempt to reconstruct the bridges in a very short time. Of course, ships, the Americans, all of the ships would come from the United States at that time. One of the most common ships at that time was something called the Liberty ship, which was mass-produced during World War II. This became the main source of post-war shipping that many of our shipping lines would eventually buy and operate until the 1960s. Landing craft were all over the place. So they were also adopted. They were made into transportation. This particular one has seats in it, actually, to carry people around. Some of them were used to transport fuel or cargo or other things. But these were actually, as late as the 1960s, they were being sold for anyone who wanted to buy them. And they were very cheap at that time. Another thing that is a wartime leftover is what we'd call the Marston mat. Now, as part of developing very quickly emergency airfields, the Americans brought these steel mats with them to put on flat ground, and that would enable the planes to land very quickly. So on the left side, you see the soldiers, the engineers putting the mats on the ground. When the war ended, there was so much of this left behind that people took them over and made them into fences and gates, as you see on the right picture. So the airfields, again, the airfields were put into operation as soon as possible. This is the one in Cebu. This is in Lahug, actually, just outside Cebu. Today it's gone. This is now a computer, an IC center in Cebu today. The only sign that it used to be an airfield is there's a cafe at the end of the road there, and it has the tail of a plane there. That's the only reminder that this was, once upon a time, an airfield. And we end our talk by going back to Philippine Airlines. And after the war, again, Philippine Airlines bought a lot of these surplus American military transport planes. And again, this is here in Nielsen Field. And again, Philippine Airlines would fly, and it would fly from here initially using these World War II aircraft. I actually got to ride some of these when I was very young. And it was interesting to come in the back and walk uphill, actually, in this. It's not flat, so you'll have to hold on to the seats as you get on inside it. But let me end my talk at this point. So we did start with, we mentioned Nielsen Field in the beginning. In a way, we come back to Nielsen Field. We have seen what the pre-war system was. We saw what happened during the war. We saw a lot of adaptation, and we still can say that with today's world, we still see a lot of adaptation in this sense. So continuity is one thing that we learn from this, that somehow, despite the difficulties of today's traffic or shortages today, somehow we find a way to manage to get out of it and manage to survive. Thank you very much for listening, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Jose. That was such an enlightening talk. Very, very interesting. I'm sure that our audience is eager to continue this discussion through the Q&A. So let's officially open the floor for discussion. For our on-site audience, if you have a question, please raise your hand and one of our staff will bring a microphone to you. And for the Zoom attendees, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We give priority to that box over questions typed in the chat box. And for Facebook viewers, there is the comment section of the Facebook live stream. We'll do our best to get to all your questions. So as the lecture was going on, the chat box and the Q&A box in Zoom was already starting to fill up. But I'd like to begin with a comment because I thought it was so appropriate. This is from Miguel Valeroso, who writes, "Good afternoon, everyone. I think this is a timely topic as our society contemplates the future of the jeepney, one of our cultural heritages post-World War II, and as we paint a vision of our ideal public transport system." And to accompany that comment, another viewer asked, why did the jeepney survive until today, but not the jitney or the duck?
So I think the jeepney survived. It was actually the jeepney was a variant of the jitney. It's just that the jitney, we were no longer getting that brand of pickup trucks after the war. And the jeep was so visible everywhere. Luzon to Mindanao, it was all over the place. It was declared surplus by the US Army, so we got a lot of it. So it was the easiest form of transportation that we could use. And we managed that. Why did it last so long? I think nobody ever actually tried to think of a viable alternative. What we have today are no longer the World War II era jeepneys. I still managed to ride on the actual World War II era jeepneys. The first Katipunan jeepneys actually were World War II jeepneys then. But they were later on modified. They were imported engines from Japan. There was a great deal of adaptation in the Philippine sense, in the sense that if you know what happened to the jeepney, they became more and more decorated. They had the image of the owner or the driver himself, and you have so many Filipino motifs in that. And I think what the jeepney did was it replaced the kalesa and the carretela. So we don't see the kalesa and the carretela except perhaps in Binondo and limited areas of the Philippines today. But the jeepney was something that was easier to use. The earlier forms were only 4-seaters in the back. They were called autokalesas actually. And then from the autokalesas, they became longer. And today, what we actually have are, 10-seaters or even longer than 10-seaters now. So they're straining the utility of this type of vehicle today, actually.
In fact, the jeepney is such a cultural icon of the Philippines, multiple signifiers. It's something that can be developed more. Some of these questions were touched upon in your talk, but hopefully we can get further discussion out of that. So the next question asks, hi, is it true that the tricycle started during World War II? What about the pedicab? Is that a post-war transportation? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting thing. Now, I would guess that the tricycle would start from World War II. We'd seen what the tricycle looked like then, but it was a different type. And what you've done with the tricycle today is you've motorized it. You added the motorcycle to it. But the Japanese occupation tricycle was a human. It was actually a pedicab. So I guess you can say the tricycle of World War II of the Japanese occupation developed into two branches. One was the pedicab that we know today, and the other is the tricycle as we know it today.
The next question is a bit more general, but also intriguing. This viewer asks, was there an attempt to bring the double-decker bus to the Philippines? I noticed it's not really a thing here compared to London, Hong Kong, and other places.
There was an attempt to bring the double-decker bus here, but not during the war and not before the war. It was during martial law, actually, that you had the first double-decker buses introduced here. They were imported from Great Britain, actually, and they were nice to ride. There were two types of double-decker buses, if I might say. One is that one that plied the Metro Manila route, actually, and the British imports. There was another one that essentially plied the Rojas Boulevard route, and this was the tourist bus. They were called Matorco buses at that time. So you could ride on the top and see the Manila Bay and all of this. But in the sense that the British and the Hong Kong and even Singapore, I think at one time, we did not, I think the Americans never really considered using the double-deck bus. And so it was not something that was practicable here until the martial law era.
Different colonial legacies, if I may say. Another question about importing transportation. Were there Japanese-style rickshaws here brought during the Japanese occupation?
They never did bring rickshaws in the Japanese. During the late Spanish period, I think they had started trying to do this. They had the human, instead of the horses, they did have rickshaws. But I think during the American period, they eventually faded away.
Now, moving on to the railroad system, Ambrosio asks, it seems that further railroad development was abandoned after World War II. It is ironic that the latest Skyway, NLEX-SLEX connection, is running literally over the España-Santa Mesa South Superhighway PNR lines. Any thoughts?
Actually, if you look at the post-war history of the Philippine railroads, in the case of Cebu, for example, the Cebu Railroad died. It was never resurrected afterwards. Iloilo did resurrect its train system for a while until the 1960s, and then it was overtaken by the bus system. But insofar as the Luzon train system, there were still great plans for it in the 1950s and the 1960s. In fact, that's why the term Bicol Express comes about at that time. This was an air-conditioned train that you could take from Tutuban and go all the way to Legazpi. So it was a very convenient way of moving from one. If you wanted to go to Baguio, you would take the train in Tutuban, you would go up to Damortis, and Damortis you would take a bus to Baguio. Very convenient, very comfortable. It was still running that way in the 1970s. So the railway line was not fully abandoned after the war. In fact, in the 1950s, during President Garcia's time, President Garcia even had a very ambitious plan to expand the railway line into the Cagayan Valley to get up to Tuguegarao. They actually started part of this already, and then even reach all the way up to Apari to serve as you would have two lines in Luzon going up north. That unfortunately never fully developed. The problem with rail is it's very expensive, it's very capital intensive, and if you don't have the money for it, for maintenance, it becomes very difficult to keep. And the challenge between rail and bus was always there. Motor car, bus, gasoline stations, and it was always, it seemed cheaper to operate the bus lines than the rail line. So you have, if you look at the road system, they usually parallel the railway system actually. So you have competition between motor transport and rail.
That's a really fascinating answer because you can hear so clearly the echoes of the issues we're facing today. Those same issues are exactly the same as what you just discussed. I like this next question. It's a little bit pop culture. And the question is, did pirate ships exist at the time?
Okay. During the time period we're talking about, I think they would have existed. Not in the sense that they're pirates used with the skull and crossbows flag and all of that, but we had our own version of pirates. In fact, even until the 1970s and the 80s, it depends on how you define pirates. You look at the Sulu area, for example, there's a lot of maritime traffic there that to the government, they're smugglers, they're gun runners and all of this. But to them, they said, this is our life ever since. Before the Spaniards came, we had no borders here. These were porous borders. It's only after 1946, the border is there, you cannot go that way. But they said, we've been doing this ever since. So remember, even before the Spaniards came, there was a slave trade. So whether that would qualify as pirates or piracy, it depends on whose point of view you're looking at. Of course, those who are stealing people from the Christian areas wouldn't say they're pirates. But from the Christian groups, these are pirates.
Yes. Yes. It sounds very much like, I guess, a subaltern community that just persists through the ages, regardless of what is happening in context. So from pirates, we go to a more serious question from Jessel Duque. Was the Pasig River waterway used extensively during and even after the war?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. It was extensively used before the war to transport not just people but cargo. So copra from the Laguna area to Manila Bay, loading it into ships. So if you look at pictures of Pasig River before the war, it's very active. There's a lot of transportation going on in the Pasig River. It connected Laguna de Bay and Manila Bay. Very convenient. And that's it. Before the North Harbor piers were put up, all the domestic shipping docked in the Pasig River. The Delpan Bridge was not yet there, so big ships could go all the way to the post office area. So the biggest bridge that you'd come across was Jones Bridge. So from Fort Santiago all the way to the post office, large ships could dock there. Now, when they built Delpan Bridge, that meant they could no longer come in. Only the barges could get in. And by that time, they had already developed North Harbor, which was a plan of the Commonwealth anyway to help ease up the traffic in the Pasig River. So they were building the North Harbor area when the war started. And after the war ended, the U.S. Army was using that as an unloading station. Then after that, it became the domestic terminal for ships. So Pasig River was very much in use, even up until the 60s. You'd have barges all over the place. Now they've cleaned it up somewhat. The last time I was in Fort Santiago, I was surprised at how little traffic was there in the Pasig River, actually.
And our next question is from Rommel Celoso, who asks, what's the difference between a calesa and a carretela? Thank you.
One of them is a strictly passenger vehicle. It only carries 2 people in the back. And the other one is a passenger cargo vehicle. It carries people. It's like a jeepney, actually. The carretela is like a jeepney. So you have the back, you have people facing each other, and you can also put cargo there. So one was more people-oriented, rather, not just people-oriented, but more romantically conceived, perhaps, because it was only good for 2 people, and the other was more of a mass transit and cargo system.
Thank you. We're moving on to ships now, and I apologize in advance if my pronunciation is going to be off. But Irene has a fascinating question. She asks, Batel was a term I thought was unique to my home island, Suluan. We use it to refer to foreign sailboats stopping in the island after crossing the Pacific. I wonder where the term came from.
I would think that the term Batel, as it was used during the war, Suluan is on the eastern side of the Philippines. So it's just off Leyte, actually. So ships coming from the Pacific would inevitably pass that area. But the term Batel that we're using here, I think, is more of the Visayan, the Ilonggo, the Negros area, because Suluan is more on the Leyte side, on the Pacific side. So this was inter-island shipping and not international shipping.
As a funny anecdote, John and I were also curious about Batel, so we looked it up, and we had this strange, very strong French pronunciation of the word. So we thought perhaps that was the origin. Dr. Jose, we are a little over time. Are you willing to take more questions?
Yes. Has a question.
Yes. Rico, thanks very much for that wonderful talk. Your mention of the Pan Am Clipper reminded me that this was the medium of transport of choice of like Hollywood royalty when they came over here before the war, and I was reminded of one famous passenger, Ernest Hemingway, when he came here in 1941, on his way to Hong Kong with his wife Martha Gellhorn, who was a war correspondent. No? And so he used the clipper then. But my question has to do with the dokar. I found out that it's still being used in Indonesia. as the dokar. And I mean, that's a term. When I looked it up, I didn't find the dokar in terms of World War II Philippines, but as Indonesian transport today. And it looks exactly the same. You have a horse and like car wheels, at the back. Were you aware of this? And where does the word come from?
Yeah, that's new to me actually, and I'm not sure of the etymology of the word actually. It just suddenly comes out in the newspapers, and everybody is saying dokar. It might have been a conjunction of car or automobile with another word. I've not gone into the etymology, but it's very fascinating that Indonesia would have the same thing. Possibly other Southeast Asian countries might also have had the same thing, because the transportation problem would have crossed borders. Malaysia, Singapore, they all had the same phenomena. And so it would be interesting to do a comparative study to see how they all survived. But interesting that it's still in use. I mean, the word is still there.
There are a number of questions left on Zoom. I'm not sure how many more we can answer, but we will do our best. The next one is from Jomil, who says, "Good afternoon, Dr. Jose. Can you explain further on the role of trains, particularly in the Death March, where they carried the POWs in the latter part?"
Yeah. Okay, so as we know, the Death March, it would have started in Bataan, and they were all forced to march by land until San Fernando, Pampanga. And in San Fernando, Pampanga, some of them stayed overnight in the cockpit or in the hospital or wherever. And then they were brought to the San Fernando Railroad Station, where they were loaded into not passenger cars, but boxcars. And then the doors were closed, and many of them suffocated there. So actually, if we are familiar with movies about the last solution, the final solution in Europe, where you see the Jews being herded into trains, that was the scene that we saw in San Fernando, Pampanga. And there is one railroad car of that type that is now in Camp O'Donnell. It serves as a museum piece there. It's the last surviving car of its type that the Manila Railroad Company allowed to be placed in the area of the prison camp. Then it went up to Kappa Station, and they all debarked, they all unloaded, and they marched the last 16 or so kilometers to the camp. What is of particular interest here also is the distance from San Fernando to Capas is not really that long. And if you have the train running at full speed, it should have taken about an hour or so. But the prisoners would say the trains were probably deliberately slowed down. So it took them the whole day, and they were under the sun. And if you are in a boxcar that's closed off, this is April, the sun is shining on the roof, you get very hot inside. That's why many of them collapsed when they got out in Capas. Incidentally also, in relation to this, both San Fernando Railroad Station and Capas Railroad Station still exist. Both are museum pieces. In the case of San Fernando, the tourism department has taken it over, and they're highlighting not only that Death March, but the fact that Jose Rizal visited that station once upon a time. So you look at the historical marker, it says Death March, Jose Rizal. And the Capas station is still there also. The rails are gone, most of them have been stolen, but it also houses a small museum inside with relics from the Death March.
And the fascination with the jeepney continues. The question from Gianfranco asks, "I'd like to ask about the post-war jeepneys. They seem smaller compared to modern jeepneys today. How much capacity did those smaller jeepneys have, and how did they become bigger over time?"
Yes. Okay, the first jeepneys were, as shown in the picture, you only had about 4 people in the back, 2 facing each other. Eventually, they were expanded to 6, 3 facing each other. So the first jeepneys were actually called also autocalesas, and they serviced very short, maybe 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer routes. And as the need for public transportation became more pronounced, somebody, I think the Sarao company is one of those who was at the forefront of developing the modern jeepney. They extended it from 4 to 6 to 8. And that the 8, I think, became more or less standard by the 1960s. By the 70s, they were trying to increase it to 10 or even longer than that. So there is definitely a change. There is an evolution of the jeepney. And one reason why they were able to become longer also was that the engines they were using by the 60s and the 70s were not anymore the World War II engines, which were gas guzzlers. These were meant as military vehicles, very powerful. So you didn't need that same kind of military technology for a jeepney. So these were, by the 70s, you now have Japanese engines coming in here. And then the local body makers, Sara was predominant in this, were manufacturing the bodies here. So they maintained the front of the old jeepney, but everything else was basically made here already.
I am very conscious of the time and how we are over the limit. So I will just choose 3 last questions to wrap up the Q&A. And there are still 22, so we just cannot finish them all today. This question is about PAL. Good afternoon, Dr. Jose. How did PAL cope up after losing their aircrafts after World War II? And can you recommend any references for the history of PAL that could be useful for academic papers? Thank you.
Okay, very interesting question. Yeah, remember, PAL was very new when the war broke out. They had their first flight was April 1941. By December, they were seized and the planes no longer existed. Now, one advantage that PAL had, of course, was that PAL's owners were rather high up in society. They had friends in the US military. So PAL was one of the first airlines that managed to secure for themselves American military planes that were now declared surplus, and the owners bought it. So they first flew domestic flights. The other big airline company that developed after World War II was something called Far Eastern Aviation Transport Incorporated, FIATI. So when you look at that college, that school in Quiapo, FIATI was actually an airline, and they specialized in aviation engineering. They used to have planes in the basement before, and you'd study aviation technology there. So FIATI and PAL were the first post-war airlines, and they did benefit from these surplus American aircraft. And they were flying domestic, but PAL actually by 1946, I think, actually had an international flight to Hawaii. So PAL was really jumping into the post-war world. Now, what source can you use for that? The classic source for aviation history is something called, I think it's Trails in Philippine Skies by Enrique Santos. He was a journalist, but he was also an employee of PAL. So it is a concise history of aviation in the Philippines from the beginning until, I think, the 1970s. Unfortunately, it is hard to navigate. It is a chronological thing, straight chronological thing without chapter divisions. So within the chapter, you're just moving from one flight to another, and there's no index, so something that's rather difficult to use, but it is a mine of knowledge. And for the pre-war aviation industry, there were several articles that came out in pre-war periodicals. Philippine Magazine in particular wrote about Philippine aviation and so forth. So there are sources. PAL actually was also issuing an annual report to its stockholders, and that is at least one other source we can use for PAL.
Thank you. I'm sure our researcher appreciates that specific book that they can use. This question is also quite serious. It asks, what were the difficulties faced by the guerrilla navy in conducting their activities during the war? I remember seeing images of Batels loaded with arms for Luzon from my hometown in Leyte.
Yeah. Of course, the main problem, the main difficulty that the guerrilla navy faced was they might get challenged by a Japanese patrol boat. And while the Batels were moving all over the Visayas in Mindanao, there were very active Japanese patrol boats that were going around the Visayas in Mindanao. And they would periodically stop these boats. And so if you were carrying those arms and you were apprehended by a Japanese patrol boat, your luck runs out. Either you fight to the death or you're captured and killed. So that was a major difficulty that they had. So some of them, when they would see a Japanese patrol boat, would flee, and some of them could actually move faster because they knew how the wind was going, their sails were efficient and all of that. So some of them were able to flee properly, but there were quite a number that were caught by the Japanese, and they paid with their lives. So it was really a cat and mouse type of thing. You know, if you were lucky, you escaped. If you were unlucky, you were caught and killed.
And for our last question, I apologize to those that I was not able to reach. There are still over 20 questions in the chat box, but this question is very contemporary, related to today. And it says, with gas prices rising and alternative fuels gaining more importance these days, do you think there is a future for the alcohol coconut gasoline that was used during the Japanese occupation? Thank you.
Yes, actually, we did try alco-gas some time ago. I think during martial law, there was a gas crunch, actually, and we did try to use alco-gas again. The trouble with alco-gas is your engine will tend to wear out faster if it's not cared for properly. And one sign of adaptation also is the jeepneys originally ran on gasoline. That was expensive. So they were reconfigured to run on diesel, which was cheaper. The problem with diesel is that they're more smoke-belching vehicles, and again, the maintenance costs are more expensive. So most of the jeepneys we actually have today have already been configured into diesel. Now, are there alternative fuels to that? Can we go back to alco-gas? Can we go back to coconut fuel? Can we go back to the charcoal bus type of thing? But then the pollution would definitely get much worse if that happens. But given the fact that Filipino inventors have always been very, very constructive, very ingenious in their ways of solving problems, I think Filipino inventors were talking about hydrogen as an alternative fuel many years ago. And they said that that particular use of hydrogen had always been stymied or having always blocked by the big oil companies, because the big oil companies would stand to lose if you have hydrogen-powered vehicles. So now I think hydrogen is being experimented on in Japan, but Filipino inventors were actually working on that way back 30, 40 years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Jose. That was an incredibly rich Q&A discussion. We could literally go for another hour if I really finished the questions here in the chat box and Facebook. But before you, please stay there. May I ask the head of FHL, Sir John Labella, and our head librarian as well, Cecil Eisen, to come forward and to receive the donation of Dr. Jose's latest book.
You're supposed to sign.
Dr. Jose, perhaps you could also inscribe the book at the podium?
So it's more well thought.
Ah, all right. A more thoughtful inscription to follow. And thank you, sir. I will just stay here, but let me introduce our final speaker for the afternoon, who will give us our closing remarks. John B. Labella, the head of Filipinos Heritage Library, is a scholar of literature and an award-winning poet. His poems have earned back-to-back first prizes from the Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards and the Philippines Free Press. A former Fulbright Fellow with a doctorate degree from Princeton, John continues to study transnationalism in Philippine literature and in Asian American poetry, as well as the relations between the United States and Latin America as represented in American poetry. He has taught at Ateneo de Manila University and the University of Illinois at Urbana. His recent essay linking Philippine urban studies and the crime novel is part of the anthology Beauty and Brutality, published by Temple University Press. Please welcome Mr. John Labella.
So I prepared written closing remarks because a lot of people after these talks are often worn down by listening to the wealth of information that lecturers share and that question and answer portion also elicits. I wish to thank Dr. Rico Jose for sharing with us his insights into our transportation history, and I equally thank the audience for engaging this talk with very sharp questions. In two more free lectures in the series, Tom McKenna will be speaking about the resistance that Moro warriors waged against the Japanese in World War II, and Genevieve Clotario will be approaching women's wartime experience through the lens of pre-war history's Carnival Queens. I hope that everyone here, and that includes people on Zoom, can attend the whole series of talks held in memory of Mr. Roderick Hall. As I reflect on this afternoon's exchanges on transport, I could not help thinking back to Mr. Hall's pre-war boyhood and his coming of age in wartime. In the book Manila Memories, he recalls taking a 6-seater airplane from Manila to Baguio in the 1930s. He also recalls a park along Dewey, now Rojas Boulevard, where he and his brother Ian played, enjoying views of Manila Bay. But during the war, during the Japanese occupation, he watched that very road turn into a runway for military planes. He witnessed planes attacking Manila, and he felt the ground shake when the bombs fell at the beginning and at the end of the war. The paradox must have puzzled the boy that he was, the paradox being that the instruments for making our world coherent can also be used for its destruction. It is not too hard to guess that grappling with this contradiction spurred an entire lifetime spent on collecting World War II materials and supporting efforts to make sense of it. There can be no doubt in our minds that all his life, Mr. Hall worried about the work of retrieving coherence, not just for himself, but for everyone wounded by history. Again, thank you for listening to today's Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures.
Thank you, John, for those closing remarks. They are a fitting end to the afternoon. As Sir John mentioned, the Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures is a series of 3 talks. We hope that you'll be able to join us on April 1 for the next talk by Genevieve Clotario on Queen Makers, Power, Politics, and the Manila Carnival Queen Contest. Thomas McKenna concludes the lecture series on April 15 with Unsung Heroes of Mindanao, the Moro resistance fighters of World War II. And if you enjoyed today's free lecture, please follow FHL's social media pages for updates, as well as the Ayala Foundation and the Ayala Museum. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. The Ayala Museum and Filipinos Heritage Library are open to visitors and researchers. To book a visit or to learn about upcoming programs, go to ayalamuseum.org and filipinaslibrary.org.ph. Thank you, everyone, for joining us to commemorate Roderick Hall and to preserve the legacy that he entrusted with FHL. And that closes our first Roderick Hall Memorial Lecture.
Rod described himself as a man with a mission and a man in a hurry. His mission was to collect as many materials on the experiences of Filipinos during World War II and to place them in a library that would ensure that these are shared with today's generation as well as those in the future. And he found this repository as well as partners with us in the Filipinas Heritage Library. So in 2010, Rod shipped his entire collection, lock, stock, and barrel, of 700 volumes from his home in London to FHL in Makati. Through the years, his collection has grown to more than 2,000 print and non-print materials on World War II, making the Roderick Hall collection FHL's crown jewel. As such, it is FHL's centerpiece, literally and figuratively, because we now revolve our collection focus around the period immediately before, during, and right after World War II, identified as the formative period of Philippine nationhood.
To collect books and various other historical materials relating to the Philippines during that war and to make this more accessible to the general public. He turned this collection over to the Filipinas Heritage Library, where it now forms a major part of its holdings as the Roderick Hall Collection. But Rod was not one to simply donate books. He wanted other people to use them and to research more on the war. He wanted to add more materials and was constantly in search of new directions for the collection. To this end, he was able to negotiate digitization of numerous manuscripts in various collections around the Philippines. He wanted to provide as many different perspectives as possible, and when he learned of the large body of works in Japanese, aimed to acquire as much as possible for the collection.
Why are you collecting Japanese publications about the Battle of Philippines, even though you do not understand Japanese language? You said to me. I always answer this question like that. I want next future generation to know what happened in Philippines during the Asia Pacific War and the Philippines under Japanese rule. However, you told me the real reason is that collecting Japanese books is to make peace of my mind and making requiem for my deceased family. As a post-war Japanese generation, I promise you to try to make no more war society and also to try not to create the kind of people such as you and your family horribly experienced in Philippines. I think the Japanese should know the facts of this history. I believe this is my mission as a Japanese.
Current thinking on the previous century, with its many upheavals and wars, is that we all have an ethical obligation to remember that history. But understandably, not everyone takes up that burden because the memory of war, especially for persons who witnessed it, is painful. The late Mr. Rod Hall was deeply courageous in that sense of taking up an ethical burden. He took pains to give World War II its proper mourning, not just for himself, but also for our country, America and Japan, whose materials he collected. He helped strengthen our cultural memory in the hope of preventing the return of suffering. And now with his passing, we in turn at Filipinos Heritage Library and Ayala Foundation have an obligation to make his legacy and his commemoration of history endure.